Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the height of white supremacy, looking at the era of 1900 to 1930. In this conversation, we're going to look at, first of all, some introductory material and essentially try to make the argument that America was at the height of white supremacy in this era, and that you can find that in American society, you can find it in the government, and you can find it in the church. And then we're going to look at how uh, blacks organized in this period and begin to organize. The work of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP and Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching campaign. And we're going to look at the Great Migration, the tremendous movement of millions of Black Americans that began in this era into the North, in part because of World War I. We're also going to look at the race riots that came as a result of that. And then lastly, we're going to look at the Harlem Renaissance, this rebirth of Black consciousness that occurred in the 1920s in Harlem. We're going to look in particular at the concept of the new Negro as was advanced by Alan Locke. And then we're going to look at Marcus Garvey and Black nationalism. So we're going to see this white supremacy existing in this period in society, government, and the church. So in society, we need to understand that this period was probably the most racist period in all of American history. And that's because, when slavery ended in 1865, a real battle ensued between white and Black Americans to keep Black Americans from becoming equal members of society. And in that battle, white Americans made the argument for white supremacy. They made the argument for segregation. They made the argument for disfranchisement of Black Americans and sharecropping. And so, in the course of making those arguments, the lost cause argument made by Southerners, in the course of making those arguments, it's like a seed was planted and watered during the late 1800s. Jim Crow is established, and it is 1900 to 1930 in which that seed of those ideas grows into its full fruition, that it starts to bear fruit, and people just begin to assume this is the way things are. We see that in society, we see it in government, we see it in the church. We also need to realize that we are connected, more connected to this than we think, because the early 1900s, this period that we're looking at of intense racism, was the period in which my grandparents were born. And in that world, you have to understand there are people living who used to be slaves. And as I was thinking about this, it just was really striking to me that my grandparents lived in a world where they could rub shoulders with human beings that were owned as property. That's the reality of their world. And therefore, I knew people who were slaves. That's fascinating to think about in 2021 that that's possible. I also know that my grandparents had lots of problems with racial ideas that were not correct. And so they were very much, uh, to me, they are very much an example of what the thinking of this period, how it affected the racial thinking of people. So it's prevalent. And one of the ways we see this in white society is what we call white minstrelsy. Now, this had been around before the 1900s, became very popular in the early 1900s. And that's what we talked about before with the Jim Crow stuff. This is white people performing in black makeup, or what we call blackface, exaggerating their features, and then acting in disparaging and stereotypical ways towards Black people. And you see some of the the different characters in the picture frame here of that were created by these white entertainers, and they would perform and they would portray blacks as dim-witted, lazy, superstitious, buffoonish, happy-go-lucky, and as predators. And this is a key problem of this age. And this is what entertained people. This is what people enjoyed at this time. Now, these ideas were this performance of blackface and white minstrelsy was very popular in this period, but it keeps going all the way into the 1950s with reasonable popularity, but it's still existing in one form or another into the 1970s. And that's important to understand. It's also important to understand that blacks pushed back against this, and there's something called black minstrelsy, and there are some performers who were black and would dress up in blackface, and they would reverse the characters to make fun of white people. So the this affects people. You know, this sort of thing, this prevalence of this kind of thinking and this deep, deep racism in society is really important for us to understand and try to come to terms with. There's also white supremacy seen within the government. The presidents of the era are pretty much all segregationists. I'm just going to highlight three of them so we can kind of understand. Theodore Roosevelt, famous president, very popular on Mount Rushmore. He invited Booker T. Washington for dinner at the White House. And as a result of that, there was a huge blowback because he invited a black man to the White House. And Theodore Roosevelt never invited a black man to the White House again. Theodore Roosevelt's administration was responsible for the terrible error in judgment in convicting soldiers in the Brownsville affair of 1906. These are where black soldiers were convicted wrongly and then later exonerated for a racial incident in 1906 in Brownsville, Texas. So there's Roosevelt for us. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister from the South. Wilson decides to segregate federal offices during his administration. And Wilson also allowed the film Birth of a Nation. This is the first film ever created. Again, to go back to the society point, it is the most racist film you could ever imagine viewing. And it was created in the 19 teens. It was previewed at the White House. It glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. It has racial stereotypes all over it. And you really should at some point take a look at it, not for entertainment purposes, but to see the depth of white supremacy and racism in this era. So that's where Woodrow Wilson is. Herbert Hoover, the last president of the era, Republican, he is responsible in large part for the development of segregated housing in America and many, many problems that exist for Black Americans with regard to housing that we're going to talk about later. And so within the government, it is a pro-segregationist white supremacy world that we are looking at in the government. And so just like society, government is lining up with society at this time. And then you have the church. The church is mixed in on many levels. The Ku Klux Klan that we've talked about before, mixed Christianity. The Ku Klux Klan was an organization that was rooted in Christianity. It mixed Christianity with nationalism and white supremacy. It is in this era that the first cross burning by the Ku Klux Klan occurred. Just imagine the imagery of the symbol of Christianity, the cross where Jesus died, being burned as a representation of white supremacy. At this time, we have Catholic schools. And you have to understand that there aren't a lot of Roman Catholics in the country until the late 1800s, when immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe brought a lot of Catholic families to America. And the result of that immigration is that Catholics become integrated into society. Now, at first, they experience a lot of negative reaction to their presence here. But the difference is that they ultimately become accepted into society. And by the early 1900s, there's churches and schools, but Catholics had segregated schools. And so we see segregation and white supremacy within the Roman Catholic Church. This is also the era where Pentecostalism, kind of a new church movement, occurs in the early 1900s. William J. Seymour, an African American, kind of is on the front end of this as the leader of what's called the Azusa Street Revival. But William J. Seymour was unable, when he went to Los Angeles where this great revival occurred, he was unable to get a position in a church, so he had to take a black church over because he couldn't get a position in a white church. Back to the issue of segregated Catholic schools, this is also the era in which the first Catholic priest in America, a black Catholic priest is ordained or is actually becomes a priest in America. But that Catholic priest had to be, his name was Augustus Tolkien. He had to be educated in Rome because none of the schools in America would ordain him. So he had to go to Rome to be educated and ordained and then come back here to serve as a Catholic priest. So Pentecostalism is on the rise, and there's going to be racist issues within Pentecostalism. Um, there is also a movement called the social gospel that's on the rise in this period. This is a group of Christians responding to industrialization and bad conditions in work environment and poverty, growing working poor and poverty in America. Then they're going to say Christians should fight against social injustice. Walter Rauschenbusch is one of the most famous social gospelers. He wrote the book Christianity and the Social Crisis. And these people are going to make an argument we should fight for justice. But the social gospelers largely were either silent on issues of race or racist in their actions and in their words. And so even the movement that is there to help people that are in suffering injustice is not going to come alongside of Black Americans. And then, as a reaction to the rise of the social gospel, you have in the 1920s the rise of fundamentalism within Christianity. And the fundamentalists are going to push back and say, we don't need to fight social justice, social injustice. We just need to essentially practice the fundamentals of the faith. And that group is going to be even less inclined to be concerned with the situation of Black Americans in this period. So the church, sadly, on pretty much all levels, is not providing an adequate response, is not coming alongside of African Americans. It's not protesting the white supremacy of the era, but it is clearly being affected by it. And while the KKK obviously is adopting Christianity, and not all Christians are part of the KKK, there are some people that believe that there may be thousands of ministers who were secretly members of the KKK. So there's involvement there, at least on some level. And so the church is infected by white supremacy, like the government and like the society in general in this era. So, with that context in mind of these issues and the prevalence of white supremacy, we want to ask the question, as we look at blacks choosing to organize uh, themselves. Why would blacks organize themselves? Until this era, blacks really had not created any sort of organization of their own interest. So why would black people organize? Alan Locke, the author of the very important and influential essay, The New Negro, said this: each generation, however, will have its creed, and that of the present is the belief in the efficacy of collective effort in race cooperation. This deep feeling of race is at present in the mainspring of Negro life. It seems to be the outcome of the reaction to prescription and prejudice, an attempt fairly successful on the whole to convert a defensive into an offensive position, a handicap into an incentive. So what Locke is saying is that Black Americans are organizing. They are cooperating with each other in this era in response to prejudice, in response to inequality. And what they are trying to do is go from being defensive to being offensive, to taking taking to the offense and becoming proactive to try to speak out on the issues that are affecting their lives. So why would we organize? We would organize in order to make our case, in order to um, advance our interests as a group, to take uh, offensive, to take to the offense, and to become offensive in trying to accomplish the things that matter to us. The leader of certainly this Black organization and the most critical figure would be W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is going to push back against Booker T. Washington's accommodationist ideas. Remember, Washington said that Black Americans shouldn't worry about getting social and political equality. If you're able to get, if white America will let you learn a trade and become economically independent, then seize that, then take that. And Du Bois said, well, he wasn't against doing that. He was against not at the same time attempting to get your political and social rights at the same time. And so Du Bois is going to say political agitation is the right way to go. We need to speak our voice. And he added two really important elements to the conversation. One is the idea of double consciousness. He does some really important work on making us aware of the idea of a Black American having two sets of identities. Uh, as an American, he's a free American, but also as a Black man. And as a Black man who's living as a free American, these two things are in conflict with each other. Because as a Black man, uh, a person would perceive themselves in society to be looked at as a problem, as somebody that has to be dealt with, or something we have to figure out. At the same time, an American, trying to reconcile those two things. So that's a really important concept that Du Bois speaks of. He also speaks of what he called the talented tenth, and he argued that there's a percentage of Black Americans who have gifts in speech and writing and in the arts and in other areas, and that talented tenth needs to have the opportunity to express themselves, and they should express themselves. And so again, this is more pushback on Booker T. Washington. So he's advocating, Du Bois is advocating to see the talented tenth express themselves and become influential as leaders within the Black community and within American society as a whole. It's in 1905 that the first organization is created. It's the Niagara Movement that Du Bois and William Trotter worked together on. And basically, this is kind of a forerunner of the more important movement that's going to come later. And in this movement, um, Du Bois and Trotter basically say blacks don't assent to keeping things the way they are, to try to work on that whole idea of blacks being content with the status quo. Now, the next organization that we're going to talk about in just a second is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that organization obviously still exists today. It's going to be extremely important as far as Black organization goes. And I want to just take a second and help us to understand that the big impetus for the creation of the NAACP was a really tragic event in Springfield, Illinois in 1908 called the Springfield riot. In Springfield, Illinois, a black man was accused of raping a white woman. This is very typical of how this worked in this era. And he was arrested and put in jail. And a white mob showed up at the jail because they were going to lynch the man. And this is very typical of events that occurred in America, but most often in the South. Well, here in Springfield, Illinois, which is in the North, this mob descends on the jail and the prisoner is not there because the sheriff moved the prisoner because he knew this was going to happen. And so, for his safety, he moved him. So, the white mob, and some of them are pictured here, turned on the black neighborhoods of Springfield and literally burned them to the ground. And so, this riot of 1908, the Springfield riot, really raised a lot of concern because not just because we've seen before that these sorts of things happen in white communities have been doing these things to black communities, and that this is not new. What's new is that it's in the North, it's in Illinois, and it raises concerns about the future and where race relations are going. So the next year in 1909, we have the creation of the NAACP. Here you have some of the founding members, and you'll notice that there are both black and white members in this founding group of leaders, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, who we're going to be talking about in the course of this conversation. They're both black and white members. The NAACP from the beginning is going to be highly focused on litigation, highly focused on the court system and working within the courts to achieve equal rights for black Americans. Now, they defined equal rights as equality before the law, political equality, the right to vote, the right to get an education, the right to work, the right to employment, and then in general, this organization was attempting to simply advance the interests of Black Americans and eradicate the effects of prejudice. And so they have a very broad mission, but they're going to apply it very specifically in the courts. Now, the very existence of the NAACP will erode the myths of black contentment. Black people coming together to organize erodes the idea that they're contented with the way things are, that they're disinterested in rights, that they don't care about rights, and that they prefer separation anyway, that they're not against segregation. They like being off to themselves. And so these myths are going to begin to erode because of the creation of the NAACP. The NAACP creates a magazine called The Crisis. That magazine is going to focus on three really specific issues. It focused on a lot of things, but three things above all else. One was black access to labor unions. The second thing was the right to vote. And the third thing was their anti-lynching campaign. Now, the leader of the anti-lynching campaign is a woman named Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells becomes famous because in the 1880s she tried to board a Memphis train and was removed, and she filed a lawsuit in response to that. Later in 1892, she's a news reporter in Memphis, and she launches an investigation into lynching, a lynching that occurred there, and she publishes her story on it. And the result of that is that a white mob descends on the offices of the paper she worked for and burned that mob burned the newspaper building to the ground. She then begins, later on, she moves north and she begins working with the NAACP specifically on anti-lynching issues, and she is advocating an anti-lynching law. She wants it to be a national law. She says lynching is Keller line murder. She says that essentially crimes against women is an excuse but not the cause, and that a national crime like this requires a national remedy. So she's arguing that lynching is a national crime and requires a law, a national law. You should know that we still do not have a national law against lynching, and they are still considering anti-lynching law in America, but it has never occurred. But she advocated for that. This picture, which is quite frankly very disturbing, but I put it in here to make a point. There were thousands of people lynched in America in the Jim Crow era. Overwhelmingly, most of them occurred in the South, and most of them were black men. And one of the things we have to understand about that was there was a pattern to the way lynchings worked. Typically, someone was accused, a black man was accused of some sort of inappropriate contact with a white woman. Either sometimes it was just looking at a white woman, sometimes it was a comment, sometimes it was drastic as being accused of rape. But nevertheless, the accusation would be made, people would find out about it, a white mob would gather, they would arrest the person or take them into, um, they would get control of them, and then they would lynch them. And you have to understand, they would put advertisements out that there's going to be a lynching at a certain place. People would gather, crowds would come, people would board trains to go see a lynching. And this picture helps us to understand. Look at these individuals who lynched this man, getting their picture taken with the body. This, I think, above all else, helps us to understand the depth of white supremacy in this era. I don't think there's anything more sobering than to see this picture and to understand that people got their picture taken um, because they thought that they were doing something good and just. And the depth of evil of this of the white supremacy that ruled this era. So as we move on from that very tough conversation, one of the more positive things that's going to happen in this era, and there's going to be negative results to it and positive results, but it's going to be the movement north that occurs beginning in 1916. And so that's the beginning of what we call the Great Migration. There's going to be millions of black Southerners who are going to move north. And my question is that we should consider is, why would black Americans move north? Why move? Moving is disruptive. And in mass, why would black Americans move? Americans came from other parts of the world and came here. Why would you do that? This is a big choice, and I want you just to consider the gravity of the choice to move from south to north. Why? Alan Locke, in again his essay The New Negro, said, "The wash and tributary of this human tide on the beach line of the northern city centers is to be explained primarily in terms of a new vision of opportunity, of social and economic freedom, of a spirit to seize, even in the face of an extortionate and heavy toll, a chance for the improvement of conditions. With each successive wave of it, the movement of the Negro becomes more and more a mass movement toward the larger and the more democratic chance. In the Negro's case, a deliberate flight, not only from countryside to city, but from medieval America to modern." That's a fascinating statement that he makes, but it's simplified by saying it's an opportunity. Why move? It's an opportunity for social and economic freedom. That doesn't mean they're going to find those things when they get here, but it's certainly perceived as an opportunity, and massive numbers of people are going to move as a result. Now, the opportunity to move comes from World War One. White Americans, many go off to fight the war, and many black Americans in segregated units fight in the war as well. That opens up jobs in the industries of the North. And so while there's still racism in the North, the job opportunities are there, and black Americans are going to start going north in 1916. Now, this larger migration continues all the way into 1970 and probably totaled as many over all those years as 6 million people. The most common destinations were Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Detroit. And so jobs, that's the motivation. You see a black family here pictured who moved north at this time. A really sad result of that was a series of race riots in the North in 1919 that kind of swept the country. It was called Red Summer. Eugene Williams in Chicago was murdered for venturing to a white beach, and his some white men on the beach saw a black man in their part of the beach. They started throwing stones at him and then ultimately drowned him in the ocean. And that resulted in riots in Chicago. And there were also other incidents like this. And just think about it. You have massive movement of people into a racist part of the country. Both parts of the country are racist at this time. There's going to be complications. There's going to be problems. And typically, you see this anytime there's a movement of Black Americans up in the social strata, in the opportunities that are in front of them. There's pushback, and this should not really surprise us. So we have the Great Migration, we have that movement, and that movement is going to lead to what's called the Harlem or the Black Renaissance. And so the question I have associated with that is, why Renaissance? Why would we call what happened when Black Americans came together in this new environment a Renaissance? The word Renaissance means rebirth. So I'm wondering, what's being reborn? Does something need to be reborn? Is that really the right word? Why do we call this a renaissance? Again, Alan Locke said, in this new group psychology, we note the lapse of sentimental appeal, then the development of a more positive self-respect and self-reliance, the repudiation of social dependence, and the gradual recovery from hypersensitiveness and touchy nerves. The repudiation of the double standard of judgment with its special philanthropic allowances, and then the sturdier desire for objective and scientific appraisal. And finally, the rise from social disillusionment to racial pride, from the sense of social debt to the responsibilities of social contribution, and offsetting the necessary working and common sense acceptance of restricted conditions, the belief in ultimate esteem and recognition. Alan Locke said also, therefore the Negro today wishes to be known for what he is, even in his faults and shortcomings, and scorns a craven and precarious survival at the price of seeming to be what he is not. He resents being spoken of as a social ward or minor, or even by his own, and to being regarded a chronic patient for the sociological clinic, the sick man of American democracy. So Locke is saying this is a giant leap forward for Black identity. This is something totally new. This is Black people coming together and deciding that there's a new consciousness now, that we are not accepting being viewed by outsiders and labeled and identified by them. We are going to say something new. We are no longer a problem to deal with as part of what Du Bois called the double consciousness. We're no longer the sick man of American democracy. We have our own identity, our own esteem. So the Harlem Renaissance is going to take off on that. So we're going to have writers and thinkers like Alan Locke and poets like Anne Spencer and musicians like Louis Armstrong and poets like Langston Hughes. And these people are going to speak to a whole kind of new way of thinking. You have a situation in which millions of people are now in a new setting in the North, in cities like New York. They are encountering, because the communities are segregated, they're encountering Black people from different places, and they're developing a new consciousness. And that new consciousness is one that says, you know what, it's one of self-respect, it's one of self-reliance, and it's one of racial pride. It's okay to be black. It's good to be black. We're proud to be black. It's self-esteem, self-respect, self-reliance, and a whole new community idea. Now, it's not separatist, and that's important to know. The core of the Harlem Renaissance was a way of thinking that brought Black America its own identity within the context of America, within the context of American institutions and democracy. It was an idea that brought Americans or brought Black Americans into the stream of America and what it meant to be part of America in a new way, in a different way than they had been part of America before. So it's a very, very powerful concept in the 1920s, direct result of the Great Migration. Now, another aspect of this is what we call Black nationalism, and that is the idea of Marcus Garvey. Garvey was born in Jamaica, comes into America. 1912, he forms the United Negro Improvement Association, and the organization that he created, its goal was for blacks to achieve independence from white society and to unite African people into a country of their own. So Garvey is a separatist, and he starts talking about the fact that blacks cannot ever be in America what they could be on their own. So we're going to see black nationalism and separatism later in the 1960s. We're going to talk about 1950s and 60s. This is the beginning of this idea. This is really the first real implementation of that. And so Garvey creates an organization. He's working towards this cause. What does he want? He wants blacks to form their own society where they can be completely socially, politically, and economically free. Ultimately, Garvey was investigated by the FBI and deported from the country in 1927, but he continued his work on black nationalism from abroad. So in this conversation, the height of white supremacy, we have looked at this era between 1900 and 1930, and we have seen that in society, in government, and church, white supremacy is the accepted and normal practice. It's the way of thinking. The Southern way has become the American way, as we said in our last conversation. We have also seen in this period that blacks begin to organize under the leadership of W.E.B. Du Bois, the creation of the NAACP, Ida B. Wells and her work against lynching. And then we've seen this movement of Black Americans to the North as a result of World War I, the race riots that ensued from it, but we've also seen a new consciousness, this emergence of the idea of the new Negro, the idea of self-reliance, of self-respect, of the opportunity for racial pride and thinking differently about being black in America. And then we see the offshoot of that, which is Marcus Garvey and black nationalism, the idea that blacks should separate and create their own society because they'll never be able to thrive, according to Garvey, in white society, in a white America. Some takeaways from our conversation. In the early 1900s, black leaders such as Du Bois and Wells organized a movement that directly opposed the system of Jim Crow and its accommodation by black leaders. The Great Migration of black Southerners to northern cities that began in 1916 had enormous consequences for race relations as well as black solidarity, racial consciousness, and protest. Two important black movements developed in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance, a non-separatist literary movement that emphasized self-respect, self-reliance, and racial pride within the context of American institutions and democracy, and the separatist movement of Marcus Garvey that advanced black nationalism. Some things to consider. Describe the moral implications of the different approaches of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois to racial injustice. Describe the ways moving affects individuals. Discuss the moral implications of racial pride. Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.